Creating, redeeming, sustaining God. In this pause between winter and spring, between death and new life, between dead ends and regeneration. Help us to know your love for who we are right now in this very moment. The dead parts, the living parts, the changing parts. Help us to follow your leading in the faith that you will give us what we need to be where you have asked us to be. We ask these things through Christ who makes them possible. Amen. Is there any special sharing? I actually have a Quaker quote. Surprise, surprise, if no one else has brought something. This was written by a British Quaker named Joseph John Armistead. And in 1913, he wrote, "When work does not turn out as was expected or intended, do not let it depress you. If you are working from a right motive and doing your best under the guidance of a loving Father in heaven, your work cannot be and is not failure. Remember that the Lord never lays work upon his people that he does not give them strength or ability to perform. And if it please him in the working out of his great purposes that life shall be sacrificed or cut short in the midst of the work, be assured that the work will not permanently suffer from such a cause." Are there joys or concerns, prayer requests to share? If not, then we can gather ourselves in open worship. And I will speak from the silence when I feel led. This is a reading from the 43rd chapter of Isaiah. Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters, who brings out chariot and horse, army and warrior. They lie down, they cannot rise, they are extinguished, quenched like a wick. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. The wild animals will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches. For I give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people, the people whom I formed for myself, that they might declare my praise. I am not really one to grow houseplants. In fact, most houseplants that I am given are dead within 6 months, not from deliberate malice on my part, but from forgetfulness. Nonetheless, not knowing this about me, people sometimes give me houseplants. That's what happened many years ago now when someone gave me a ficus tree about 3 feet high, which I still remember. I was actually fond of the plant, perhaps because it was actually a tree, and I tried to care for it, but it did not thrive. It lost leaves, gained them back, it lost them again. I asked my sister, who is an ecologist and lives surrounded by plants, why my ficus tree kept losing its leaves. Because that's what they do, she said. They lose leaves. They lose leaves if they're too dry or if they're too wet. They lose leaves if they're too hot or too cold, if they have too much light or too little light, if they get moved or if they don't like the location they're in. That's just the way ficus plants are. She tried to tell me that the ficus would be okay, but I had a hard time believing it. When I looked at the tree in one of the phases where it had 8 branches sticking out and only 3 of those branches had leaves, and one of those leafy branches had only 2 leaves hanging limply off at the end, I had a difficult time believing that the ficus was going to be okay. It was always a mystery. At one point toward the middle of February, it began to thrive. It put forth new branches, put forth all kinds of new leaf sprouts. It looked like it was suddenly going to break forth into green life. And then just as suddenly it went into decline. All the new leaf sprouts withered and turned black. The entirety of one long twig was lined with blackened leaf sprouts. 6 or 7 branches lost all their leaves entirely and began to turn brittle. It was barely possible to hope that the ficus would continue to live after that die-off. And then at the end of March, there came a true spring day. Under the influence of spring, I threw open all the windows of the house, lifted up the storm panes and put the screens in, and it was windy all day long. The bedroom where the ficus lived had windows on 3 sides, and the wind blew through the room all day, banging window shades against windowsills, lifting papers off the bed, and shaking the last 7 leaves of the little tree, which responded in a remarkable way. It began to grow. Leaf sheaves sprouted and opened, and I could almost see the leaves lengthening in front of my eyes. Branches that I had taken for dead and nearly trimmed from the tree were sprouting little green tufts at their ends. One day I was ready to dump a dead tree out of its pot and into the ravine, and the next night I thought it might live after all. In a way, this is just another version of our annual springtime revelation about the cycle of life and life beginning anew. But what I especially noticed about that ficus tree was that its new growth was not simply new life like new wheat or a freshly seeded lawn. The ficus exhibited new life precisely in the places that I took for dead. The branches on the tree which I had given up for dead were bearing life the next morning. The new had sprung up not in a different place from the old, but within the very heart of the old. When I think about it, I can see how my own life is often that way. Even when I want to be transformed, to become different in some way, transformation doesn't happen the way I direct it to happen, and it doesn't happen, for me at least, as an act of will. It is an act of prayer, an awareness of a wall across my path, and then the realization that somehow I am beyond the wall. I can look back and see the wall, but whether I climbed the wall, found a way around it, or buried my way beneath it, I'm never quite sure. All I know is that there is new life in a place I had given up for dead. And I don't think this is true for me alone. I think it can also be true of our life and community. It was certainly that way for the Israelites. We look at the passage with which I began from Isaiah 43 about an extinguished army and the honor of jackals and ostriches. And it's hard to understand at first what the prophet is talking about. What does he mean when he says, "Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old? I am about to do a new thing"? We have to take the entire setting for that verse if we want to understand what it means for us. In the first couple of verses, Isaiah is talking about God's deliverance of the Israelites through their exodus, about the way God delivered those people from the vast might of the Egyptian army. He is remembering that story, the story which those people used to define themselves and their relationship to God, and he is saying, don't get hung up on those old resentments. You are much more than simply the enemy of the Egyptians. Don't define yourself in that way. And don't live forever in that past glory either. You are not only the people through whom God once worked. You are the people through whom God is working now. Our story with God is not the story of some used to be. It is the story of our present. What are we going to do about our life in God right now? In her speaking and her writing, Quaker minister Jan Wood always insists that who we are right now is enough to do what God is asking us to do. We have all that we need, everything we need to do as a community the work to which God is calling us. I've heard her give that message many times. And then I often hear an objection to that message, a kind of mini outrage. And people say, but that means that we are settling. Individually and collectively, we're settling. We're giving up on the idea of being better people than we are. If we accept that who we are now is enough and is sufficient, isn't that the same as saying that we never have to be any better? Well, no, it isn't the same. It is more along the lines of saying, here I am, God, here we are, with all our dead branches and blackened leaves. Even so, we know that you, who made these branches in the first place, can bring them to life again. Or you can grow new branches in their place. Either way, plant me where you will. We can embrace the idea of being called right here in this very place and within these very circumstances. We can accept that in this present moment, God is working something new right here and right now. And to do so, to accept that, is not equivalent to giving up on the idea of becoming. We never give up the idea of and hope for transformation. we will still be transformed. We will always be transformed when we open ourselves to God's leading. That's the message of the entire New Testament. And Easter, which in a church kind of way is what we are preparing for, and yet what is always with us, Easter is the message of how we will be transformed. We will be transformed in the dead and broken places where new life will spring forth, where there will be water in the wilderness and rivers in the desert and green leaves on my dead ficus tree. This isn't, I think, just an abstract thought. I have the sense that together we are waiting for what will come. We talk about getting back to the new normal without knowing what that means or whether we want the new normal to be exactly the same as the old normal. And there are our places of confusion that have not changed at all because of the pandemic. What does it mean to live in the countryside where people are sparsely scattered, where resources seem to be fewer, where the end of the world will come 20 years later, at least if we have to wait for it to be brought by the internet? What does that mean? And God's answer now is, as it always is, who we are is enough for what God is calling us to do. And who we are becoming will also be enough. In all of our hurts and wounds, in all the walls and miles of distance that block our way, despite drought and heat and cold, new green leaves are pushing to the surface. We can't even predict what those new leaves will look like, whether they will be orchid flowers or ficus leaves, but because we have experience of how God works, we know they are on their way. And even in this time of not knowing what the world is becoming, having that knowledge of how God works shifts our question. We have a tendency to ask, what can we do? But the better question is, what is God calling us to do individually and together? Because whatever God is calling us to do, we have all the resources we need to do it. Will you be with me in prayer, please? Creating, redeeming, sustaining God, we confess that it is always difficult and sometimes impossible to hear and to follow your leading. There are so many other voices to which we are attentive, and so much busyness that gets in the way. Help us find the capacity to be quiet, to listen for your guidance, your prompt, your concerns. And the confidence that those promptings, those leadings, those invitations are the places where we will find joy and love and meaning. We ask these things through Christ who makes them possible. Amen. Are there announcements today? Is there anything to be said about mini?
About mini yearly meeting? I think one thing that we should say is that Fairview's additions to the proposed minute were accepted and very much appreciated by the group. There was some additional tweaking that occurred, but basically the minute that we discussed most recently last week, with the additions that we kind of got together and worked on some more during the week, that went forward as a good document to be able to be released. So I think there's just some final word editing maybe that'll occur by the Wilmington Yearly Meeting Peace and Social Concerns Committee, and then it'll be distributed.
Probably be in the newspaper.
And probably be sent in as a letter to the editor, to the news journal. So I thought and I was not part of the mini meeting that discussed some updates and changes and to the sort of the processes of the yearly meeting itself. So I can't speak to that. Maybe Katie is on and she could speak to that. But before we get there, I just want to say one thing, and that is if Jenny were there and we were all in the meeting house, Jenny Harner would have quickly whipped out her hymnal and she would have led us in the hymn that I don't have the lyrics in front of me right now, but they're mold me, use me, lead me, whatever, thou the potter, I am the clay, while I am yielded and still. You see, I really bollocks the lyrics, but you probably all know it by heart anyway. So I just was really struck by how much we miss being able to turn to that. But I don't, Katie, are you prepared to speak to any of the yearly meeting or mini yearly meeting items?
It was kind of uneventful, which I don't think is a bad thing. The Envisioning Task Force presented their initial report, which was basically reading through the advanced materials that were emailed out to everybody. So there were some questions and concerns, like the fact that we forgot a steward and finance committee, which is kind of important. So the task force is going to go back and incorporate some of those suggestions and then send them out to meetings again and encourage meetings to have conversations about them. I think the plan is to invite the entire yearly meeting together again in about a month on Zoom to continue the conversation. But really out of the discussion came that everyone wants Wilmington yearly meeting to be alive and active. And this is our opportunity to kind of think through that together, and to encourage meetings to do that amongst each other, and then the yearly meeting to do that together. So you can look forward to those conversations happening in the future. I think everyone loved hearing from the new college president, Trevor Bates. He's just really engaging and shared a lot of personal stories that seemed encouraging to folks. No one asked him any hard questions. So, I think that's a good sign. Everyone's very supportive and he really wants to be involved in the community. And he sat in on our entire business session. So he's really an observer and seemed very interested and engaged in what Friends were doing. So I think we can be hopeful about the connections between Wilmington Yearly Meeting and the college going forward.
Okay, thank you.
I thought the format of committee of the whole worked well, and it
Permanent board.
permanent board.
Yeah.
And there were, how many people were on the
Permanent board meeting. I think there were, I don't know, 25 or 30 people who came together for that. You had a 45 finally. Okay, great. And there were 6 from Fairview. So we were well represented, I think, in that particular session at least. So we don't want people to forget that next weekend is daylight savings time change. So we will leap ahead, we will spring forward, which means that Sunday school, which is starting at 10 o'clock, will be closer to 9 a.m. body time.
and in order,
Just warning everyone, and Craig has figured out what chapter we're doing.
in order to help everyone remember, it is lesson 9, consistent with 9 a.m. Okay, that we're going to have, and the hymn for reference that Becky had on her computer, and then it went black, is "Have Thine Own Way, Lord," hymn number 371. Okay.
We would sing it for you, but
But
that
you
would
don't
be an
want that.
embarrassment. And the recurrent phrase, that I think that ties in so much is "Thou art the potter, I am the clay, mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still." Dan's ficus plant was yielded and still.
It makes me so sad, in the interest of integrity, to have to say that eventually it just died. It really did. But it did have this.
It brought forth a great message today, and that's good.
It was attacked by aliens, so there's an excuse there.
Further?
Offerings can be mailed to Karen. Are there any other announcements? If not, then we will see each other next week.
All right,
Sleepier than usual.
okay.
Go with God.
Thank you.